You know, sometimes it's good to look back. Sometimes it's good to look back and see where we came from. Because when we look back, what we will see is God's faithfulness, which should encourage us on how to live faithfully in the future as we move forward, or in the present, as we move forward into the future with the hope. And as I read Psalm 66 this week, I realized that that's what this is all about. It's this guy who writes the psalm. We don't know who wrote it, but he writes it from this place of looking back, that he would live faithfully in the present so he could move forward in the future, still leaving a faithful life. And so I titled our message, Faithful Worship on the Other Side of Victory. Because that's what we're going to see. As he looks back, he's going to look at these victories that they went through. And so the author, like I said, is not named, but he seems to be writing after having experienced a major victory. It may reflect a time of national rescue. It could be a reflection of what happened when they went into the temple and they worshiped and God met them there. Or it could even be some sort of personal answer to prayer. But whatever it was, what the psalmist suggests is that he had to suffer. In that suffering, he cried out to God, and God was faithful and answered him. And that's what Psalm 66 is all about. It's his response to worship and his testimony of how faithful God is. You see, this is not a picture of worship from someone who tried to avoid hardship. No, it's worship from someone who went through fire and water, as he puts it, and he found God faithful. The original readers likely were suffering as well, feeling oppressed, maybe a little bit of national instability. For Israel, this psalm would have reminded them of a few things. It would have reminded the exile in Babylon that God had delivered us before, that God could deliver us again. And maybe this one is probably the key, that God does not waste suffering, and that God hears the prayers of surrendered hearts. The Jewish readers often connected this psalm with Israel's larger story of redemption. Think Exodus. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to look back as we study this psalm with the hopes that you and I can see how to faithfully worship God on the other side of victories. You see, one of the hardest things to prepare people for in the coaching realm is how do you prepare your team after a victory? Because people tend, especially kids, they tend not to listen to you. Wait, we just won. You're old man. We have a hard time of moving forward faithfully after a victory. It's easy to say, okay, after a defeat, here's what we need to work on because we could see it. But how do we live faithfully on the other side of victory? We need to prepare ourselves for that, and that's what I believe Psalm 66 is. And so the first thing that we're going to see if we are going to live faithfully or worship faithfully on the other side of a victory is we need to remember what God has done. And we see that in the first 7 verses of chapter 66. It says, to the chief musician, a song, a psalm. Make a joyful shout to God, all the earth. Sing out the honor of his name. Make his praise glorious. Say to God, how awesome are your works. Through the greatness of your power, your enemies shall submit themselves to you. All the earth shall worship you and sing praises to you. They shall sing praises to your name. Selah. I think the writer was smart. He stopped there. He pauses. He even puts a command, Selah, which means stop, take a breath, consider, meditate on these words. And what does he want us to meditate on? What does he want us to think about? Well, the opening of this psalm is this commandment for all the earth to worship God, to make a joyful shout. Now, for some of us, that's all we can do, and that's okay, because by the time it gets to heaven, it's in tune. You can know that. But really what the psalmist wants us to consider is that worship was and is bigger than something for Israel alone. Yes, this was written and given to the nation of Israel, but it's so much greater than Israel. This is for you and I today. This is for the generations that are coming up. This is for the Briggses that I was holding. Worship is for everyone. It is so much bigger than one individual. Verse 3 tells us that worship is upward. And I think we need to remember that. Worship is upward. It's towards God. It's for God. It's not for us. Because if we're honest, we all have those songs that we just don't like. I don't like that worship song. To which I would say, who cares? It's not for you. You're like, you're a jerk. No, but let's just be honest. Worship was never intended for us to enjoy. It's a sacrifice. It's something for us to give to God. Why? Because God is worthy. Because God is awesome. It's us stepping back and saying, you know what, God? I'm going to sing to you because you are worthy, because you are awesome, because you've been faithful, because you are God. Amen. And worship is for you. And it doesn't matter if I like the song or not. I can still sing certain songs that just I have a hard time with. And when people are like, here's the set list, and it has that one song on it. You guys are like, what's the song? Don't you want to know? Not going to tell you. And here's why. Because I know that next week, Joe will play that song, so I'm not going to say what it is. We worship because God is awesome. Charles Spurgeon said this psalm begins by calling all nations into joyful, vocal praise, not silent admiration. It was a vocal thing. And again, the writer tells us, stop, think about this. I also think it's good for us from time to time to stop and pause and evaluate our worship. Am I worshiping, or am I doing this because I remember how awesome God is, or because of the feeling it creates within me? Verse 5 goes on, come and see the works of God. He is awesome. Notice the repetition of that. He is awesome in his doings towards the sons of men. He turns the sea into dry land. They went through the river on foot. There we will rejoice in him. He rules by the power, or by his power forever. His eyes observe the nations. Do not let the rebellious exalt themselves. Selah. Again, stop, pause, think about what was said. The writer says, come and see. It's an invitation for us to come back and to remember what God has done. In particular, the Exodus story. That's what he's referring to here. When God parted the seas, when God parted the Jordan. It's so amazing how God works, because this is exactly where I find myself in my morning devotions, is looking into that. As God parts the seas and they go on dry ground. And so why would the writer give us such an invitation? Why would he invite us to pause? Why would he invite us to come and see? And here's what I'm finding. He does this because we're too busy sometimes. We forget sometimes what God has done. when we're faced with a body of water in front of us and an enemy who's pursuing us, it's easy to forget how God has already delivered us. So God has to command us. So the Word of God reminds us it's okay to stop, take a deep breath. It's actually an act of faith, if you think about it. God, I'm going to trust you with this moment. I have a body of water in front of me. I have an enemy behind me, but I'm going to stop and I'm going to pause and I'm going to remember your faithfulness, because that's what's going to help me move forward faithfully when you part those waters. I mean, come on. Would you walk through that water? I wouldn't. I'm a horrible test taker, in case you didn't know. I'm the type of guy that I could come to a test and it could be 1 + 1 = and you would say? I would be, it's 6. It can't be that easy. It's a trick question. Even though I know 1 + 1 = 2, I'm still thinking it's 6 because my mind just thinks it can't be that simple. So when I would come to waters that are parted, I'd be like, no. I know I'm going to get halfway through and God's going to be like, psych. For those of you that are under 20, look it up. You'll understand what that word means. But, or maybe I'd be like, God be like, just kind of crash them on a little bit just to scare me. I mean, I would like freak out. I wouldn't go. But yet we look back and we remember how awesome God is. We see his faithfulness and we move forward. We're invited to look back, to take time out of our busyness. Why? So that we would move forward while looking back. I think that's the key. God's asking us to move forward while looking back. Why? Because if we look too far forward, we're going to get terrified. But if we look back, we're focusing on his faithfulness. We're focusing on what he's done. So for us to move forward, we must look back. And verse 6 says, and as we do that, we will rejoice. Notice the response. When we look back and we see how faithful God is, we respond in worship. It's just the most natural thing to do. And one of the things that I was thinking of the other day was, what would it take, God, for me to rejoice over the little victories? Because God's not always parting waters. God's not always blowing wind so that the ground is dry, and then when our enemies are there, letting the waves crash down and bringing victory. But like Deborah said, what about the victory of just getting up in the morning? And man, ever since 50, that's something to rejoice. Like my body makes noises I didn't even know were possible. I have body parts I didn't even know existed. Like something back here hurt this morning. I don't even know what it is, but it's annoying. You guys are like, yeah, you're old. Yeah.
Oh, you just wait.
I'm going to keep looking back. Right? But we worship as a response to God's faithfulness. We can worship because God is God. And he is a God of redemption. And when we look back, as Israel looked back at the Exodus, they were reminded that God was able to turn the sea into dry land. And that was more than just Israel's history. This would be their identity. Their identity would be established on the fact that God had delivered them from years of slavery and bondage and was taking them into the fullness of his presence into the promised land. It would become their identity. And then we're told that his eyes are there. His eyes. They observe the nations. You know what I love about that? It's such a reminder that God sees us. That he sees and he understands what we're going through. Now, verse 7 will either scare you or comfort you. It all depends on what you're doing and what he's looking at. Right? I mean, that said, God isn't surprised with all the stupid stuff that we do. He's not caught off guard. He sees it. Alexander McLaren says, God's work is never outdated. It is all a revelation of eternal activities. What has been, he is. What he did, he does. Therefore, faith may feed on all the records of the old time and expect the repetition of all that they contain. Let that sink in for a moment. What God does, God is. What he has been, he is. And for the Jew, the Exodus was that defining act of redemption on their lives. And they were told to have every generation look back at what God had done in splitting the seas as proof that God still sees our oppression, that he still sees our situation, that God still hears our cries, and that God still is making ways where there is no other way. Our faith grows when we remember what God has done. You see, God's mighty acts are meant to be the standing subject of grateful wonder. You see, the people of God survive by remembering what God has done and who God is. And yet many of us forget God's faithfulness the moment things get difficult. And know this, the enemy loves spiritual amnesia. But remembrance builds confidence. If God was faithful then, he will be faithful now. And I believe that what God wants you to know today is this, is sometimes your future hope is strengthened by remembering past deliverances. So take time and pause and look back at how God has been faithful. Remember that so that we can move forward faithfully to the next point. And that is that if we're going to worship faithfully, we need to recognize what God is doing in the fire. Notice in verse 8 it says, "Oh, bless our God, you peoples, and make the voice of his praise to be heard, who keeps our soul among the living and does not allow our feet to be moved. For you, O God, have tested us. You have refined us as silver is refined. You brought us into the net. You laid affliction on our backs. You have caused men to ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water, but you brought us out to rich fulfillment." There seems to be this shift, a dramatically different shift here. You know, now the writer talks about nets and burdens and enemies and fire and water, all these trials. He's focusing on what the people of God were suffering through. Well, what was happening? Again, the exact events we don't know, and I think God did that on purpose. Because if we would have known what they were, here's what we would have said. Well, God only works in these. No, he says, stop. It doesn't matter what was going on. You understand the feelings and the emotions and what it was like. Why? Because I want you to know that when you're feeling those same things, I'm still working. And it doesn't matter if it was 1,000 years ago, 1,000 days ago, or just yesterday. God is still working today. You see, the language suggests a national hardship and oppression. But you know what the writer doesn't look at? What he doesn't focus on? He doesn't focus on this idea that maybe in the midst of this, God has abandoned us. Because that seems to be where we all land right off the bat. God, where are you? Instead, what does he see and what does he focus on? He focuses on the fact that this is a test that God has put in our way. Now, it's not a pass or fail test. No, it's a test in the sense that what he is showing to you is that he can be relied upon, regardless of if it's fire or water that you're going through. You see, that changes everything because it gives hardship a purpose. We don't like hardship. I understand that, and we shouldn't. But when God uses that hardship to show us that really we can test him in the sense that he is worthy, trustworthy, capable, and faithful, we have something that we can hold on to when we're faced with various trials. That's why James could say, count it all joy, my brother, when you're facing various kinds of trials. You see, silver being refined was a familiar process in the ancient world where they would heat up the metal, the impurities would rise to the top, and then they would remove that. It was uncomfortable, it was hot, it was difficult, but the end result was not destruction, but purification. And when we look at this, what we see is that God is using hardships in our lives to purify our lives. Alexander McLaren emphasized that God was not absent in Israel's suffering, that he was actively using it to refine and prepare his people. And again, God does not waste our suffering. Those hardships in our lives are valuable. But it's important to feel the tension here. It's important to look at it and say, well, God, it really is hard. It really is difficult. What I'm going through, it feels like fire. It feels like it's unbearable. I may feel like I'm being overwhelmed by the waters crashing in on me. And we got to be okay with that tension. Why? Because God's okay with that. God's okay with you wrestling with your suffering. He doesn't want you to act like nothing's happening at all. Why? Because we've seen so many people that have done that. On the outside, they're smiling, but deep within, they're hurting. I go back to what that youth leader in Uganda said when asked what he learned most during COVID. And he said, people are smiling, or people are hurting with a smile on top. We can be okay with that wrestling. Think about it. Fire and water, what do they represent? Overwhelming circumstances. God's not afraid of overwhelming circumstances in our lives. He's going to use those to prove himself to you that he's faithful. The writer is very honest here. He's honest with his hurt. God, this hurts. I don't like it. It's painful. He's honest with how heavy that burden seems to be. And he's honest with his feelings, like saying, God, this seems so impossible. How are you going to get me through it? Think about Israel. There they are, water in front, enemy in back. God, we're stuck literally between not a rock, but water in a hard spot. But God made a way where there was none. You see, the ending changes the perspective, doesn't it? And notice what the writer's ending was in verse 12. But you brought us out to rich fulfillment. God, it was hard, it was difficult, but you brought us through here. You see, many people want God's promises, but without his process. But oftentimes, fire reveals what we trust, doesn't it? When God burns up those things that we trusted in, pressure often exposes what controls us. Yet, waiting has a way of deepening our dependence. You see, God is more concerned with our holiness than our comfort. And I think sometimes we forget that. And sometimes the trials They're not punishment, but rather preparation for what God is about to do. You see, the fire that you may want removed may be the very thing that God is using to refine you into the person that he longs for you to be, to make you more pure, to make you more holy. And it also may be the very thing that people need to see you wrestle with in order to find hope and know that God is who God said he is. A lot of people say, well, I don't have a testimony. No, your life is a testimony. You see, oftentimes we think my testimony has to be a rags to riches story to make it be any good. But what if your story is one of God's faithfulness? Through things that maybe aren't rags to riches, but the mundane. It doesn't change who God is. And then the final thing that we're going to see in verses 13 through 20, in order for us to faithfully worship on the other side of victory, is that we need to respond with worship and our testimony. Verse 13, I will go into your house with burnt offerings. I will pay you my vows, which my lips have uttered and my mouth has spoken when I was in trouble. I will offer you burnt sacrifices of fat animals with the sweet aroma of rams. I will offer bulls with goats. Selah. Come and hear, all you who fear God, and I will declare what he has done for my soul. I cried to him with my mouth, and he was extolled with my tongue. If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear, but certainly God has heard me. He has attended to the voice of my prayers. Blessed be God, who has not turned away my prayers, nor his mercy from me. I will go, he says. What is he doing? What is that a statement of? That's a statement of response. But it's a personal response. You see, now this psalm becomes very personal. And it's as if the writer is saying, because you have done these things, God, I will now go and I will respond. I will pay. I will bring my offerings. I will bring my sacrifices. You see, it moves from a national time of worship to a personal testimony of what God has done for this guy that we do not know his name. He will bring sacrifices. Why? Because God fulfills vows, or actually, he's going to fulfill the vows that he made. And he's publicly going to tell what God has done. And I think sometimes we don't quite understand the significance of a vow, do we? But to ancient Israel, a vow mattered deeply. You see, people often promised worship or sacrifice during distress. It's a good thing we don't do that. Have you ever said this? What, God, if you just get me out of, I will. It's the same thing. Same thing. But you know what's beautiful about it? When God answered, not if God answered, but when God answers, he went back to the temple to fulfill the vow as an act of gratitude and surrender. I don't see anything wrong with saying, God, show up. And then strengthen me to be faithful. In verse 18, Chuck Smith says, in reference to when he says, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear. It's kind of a tough passage right in the middle of all that. Like, well, wait a minute. If I'm holding on to this, the issue here is not perfection. What he's talking about is sin that we cherish too deeply. If I cherish sin too deeply, God's not going to hear me. Why? Because God responds to a surrendered heart, not one that just tries to cover it up on the outside. Because real worship is more than singing. It's a life in surrenderance to the God who has been faithful. Singing is just one aspect of it. Testimony, telling your story strengthens both you and the person that hears it. Notice that he didn't say, if you have a rags to riches story, I want you to tell it. No. He simply said, speak of how faithful God has been to you. So pause for a moment. How has God been faithful to you over the times, over your life? How has God been faithful to you yesterday? How has he been faithful for you today? Are you willing to just talk about it? It shouldn't be a foreign thing. You see, actually one of the greatest acts of worship is telling people how God and what God brought you through. So how do we tie this all up and make it neat and tidy? How do we apply this to our lives? How do we make this something that just becomes more than a theological concept, but becomes a reality? How do we live faithfully today by living a life of worship, not just singing songs at a worship time that we have set aside, 2 songs before we have communion, and then 2 afterwards, and then have our message, and then have 2 at the end? But how does our life become a faithful act of worship? We have to admit this, that some people will praise God publicly but never surrender privately. Is that you? Have you surrendered privately to the Lord? Some people will suffer silently because they're ashamed. But what if that story changed? What if you were never intended to suffer in silence? It's hard to admit what you suffer through, whether it's guilt, shame, or uncertainty. You would think at a church we could suffer together well, but I'm just going to be honest, sometimes the church is the most dangerous place in the world to suffer. Because what are people going to think of me? But we were never intended to suffer alone. We were never intended to suffer silently. But God does ask us to testify to what God has done and what God is doing. And I think sometimes that means being vulnerable. Psalm 66 calls us to surrender honestly, to worship fully, and to testify boldly. Psalm 66 takes your testimony and makes it hope for someone else who might be hearing it. You see, your testimony may become the hope that somebody else has been praying for. Psalm 66 reminds us God delivers. Always has and always will. That God does refine. Might not be easy, but it's always worth it. But God hears. And God restores. You see, we are not asked to deny our pain. We're asked to come openly and honestly and look at it with just, this is what it is. We can be honest with what hurts. We could say, like the writer of Psalm 66, God, we went through fire and water. And like the writer of Psalm 66, we can say this, but that's not the end of our story. We can have this statement be the end of our story. But God brought us out. That should be our testimony. God brought us out. God was with us. And so what if this very season you are experiencing, the season that maybe you're trying to escape, is the very season that God is wanting to teach you something. Teach you how to trust him when it's tough. Teach you how to worship him when you don't feel like it. Or how to talk about him and his faithfulness when it might become uncomfortable. You see, sometimes the greatest worship does not come from people who've avoided the fire, but from those people who've discovered God's presence and faithfulness in the midst of it. That's what Psalm 66 is all about. Because it reminds us that in the midst of fire and water, there's a God who goes through that with us. And his name is Jesus. And he always has been, and he always will be faithful. So if we are going to live a faithful life of worship in our day and age, in today, we need to remember what God has done. We need to recognize what God is doing in the midst of the fire, and we need to respond through worship and testimony of who God is.